to present in front of you all again. I wanted to start by thanking several people for their contributions to this project throughout this whole process. I wanted to thank all the people who have taken time to meet with me individually. You have provided me with invaluable information in these meetings that has allowed me to craft a better and more comprehensive bill. Second, I wanted to specifically thank Kayla for helping me set up so many of these individual meetings and just her amazing support throughout the whole process. And finally, I wanted to thank my friends and fellow law students, Millie Mummery and Harrison Bone, for helping me write the updated version of this bill. Your general environmental advocacy throughout law school has honestly inspired much of my own, so thank you all. Now, I wanted to start by just generally talking about some of the developments that have happened since my first presentation to PSN. So all of you who saw my first presentation know that along with mandating Nevada's largest food scraps generators to donate at least 50% of their excess edible food, the original bill also banned those generators from disposing of their other food waste in landfills and instead diverting it to some form of organics recycler, such as a composting facility or a livestock farm. However, as I've kind of learned through a lot of these individual meetings and just through general research, the current organics recycler infrastructure in Nevada is fairly limited. So there are some capacity and just kind of concerns about the ability to deal with any large increase in supply going to organics recyclers. So I've kind of come to the conclusion in the meantime that this aspect of the bill will likely be a longer term project. However, I still believe that there are things that can be done in the short term to help kickstart the growth of the organics recycler industry in Nevada. So while the current version of the bill doesn't have too much concerning that aspect of kind of the general projects, I'm certainly planning on adding some of it. And in this presentation, I'm hoping to kind of talk about some of the potential ideas to help kickstart this process and also answer general questions about that aspect of this project as well. However, I do believe that when it comes to the 50%, mandating 50% of excess edible food to be donated to food relief organizations, I do believe that most of the infrastructure is already in place, and this is something that can be done in full in the next legislative session and can kind of move forward. So that's, in the current form of the bill, that's really what is being focused on at the moment. And so let me just pull up the bill, and I'm kind of planning on just going through the current version of the bill, just talking about some of the additions, talking about kind of the general goals of it, and also addressing some potential questions that me, Harrison, and Millie kind of noticed when we were writing the bill, and some things that we wanted to discuss with the group as a whole. So let me just figure out how to share here.
And Alex, really quickly, would you like people to put comments in the chat, use their raise hands, or do you want to hold all questions to the end?
So I think probably hold all questions at the end. Of course, people can definitely put their questions in the chat, and kind of when I finish, I can just either address them, and also anyone that wants to just raise their hand and ask as well at the end, I think is perfectly fine too. Okay, so did you know, is it just the share tray thing? I think, okay.
Yep.
Perfect. Let me.
All right, so David, I do see that your hand is raised. Go ahead and put your thought into the chat box, and we can get to your question as soon as Alex is done presenting, okay?
Okay, perfect. Can everybody see that? Yes, okay, sorry. I couldn't see. Let me pull up this thing so I can, that's okay. Okay. So a large amount of this bill is largely similar to the original version. As I said, this version of the bill is definitely mostly focusing on the excess edible food aspect of the project, given that I believe it can be implemented pretty much right away, especially with the 3-year grace period between the passage of the bill and the bill becoming effective. So kind of going through the general goals of this bill, it would be basically implemented and placed into the NRS 444, which deals with sanitation. And in NRS 44, there's already some kind of general state policy goals listed, which are kind of listed here, whether it be protect public health and welfare, to prevent water, air pollution, to prevent the spread of disease and the creation of nuisances, to conserve natural resources, and to enhance the beauty and quality of the environment. Now, because of the further goals that would be in place if this bill was passed and implemented into NRS Chapter 444, I think that adding certain policy goals to this section of NRS would be necessary, and that they would be reduce the levels of food insecurity among Nevada's population to the lowest attainable levels, to reduce the amount of food scraps disposed of in Nevada landfills, and to increase the quality and quantity of food available to food relief organizations for distribution. And as I said, the Food Waste Prevention Act as a whole would just be added into the end of NRS Chapter 444, and it would be under the title of Unlawful Disposal of Food Scraps. And when it comes to definitions used in this bill, a lot of the words that are used in this bill are already defined under NRS 444. And so any definitions that were previously in NRS 44 would work seamlessly with this addition to it. But I also have added several other definitions as well. One of them being food scraps. Food scraps would mean inedible food, trimmings from the preparation of food, food soiled paper, and edible food that is not donated. Food scraps would also or would not include used cooking oil, yellow grease, food from residential sources, or any food which is subject to recall or seizure due to the presence of pathogens. And when it comes to who would be subject to this bill, it basically the law or this version of NRS Chapter 444 would define them as designated food scraps generators. And designated food scraps generators would mean a person who generates at a single location an annual average of 1 ton per week or more of food scraps based on a methodology established by the Solid Waste Management Authority pursuant to regulations. Designated food scrap generators would include, but are not limited to, supermarkets, large food service businesses, educational institutions, hotels, casinos, food processors, correctional facilities, sports or entertainment venues, and also for locations with multiple independent food service businesses, such as a mall or a college campus. The entity responsible for contracting all of the solid waste transporting services would also be responsible for managing food scraps from the independent businesses. Now, a few of the kind of questions that we came up with when we were writing this bill was, when it comes to educational institutions, I think I kind of want to generally discuss whether exempting lower school districts would be necessary or would be a good idea when it comes to this. This bill could possibly only apply to higher educational institutions, but in my opinion, I believe it could apply to lower school districts as well. I don't believe it would be would create much of a problem, but I think obviously people with more expertise in that area, I'm definitely happy to hear their thoughts on that. Additionally, when it comes to correctional facilities, I realize that in a lot of Nevada's smaller rural counties, there are some fairly large correctional facilities that might qualify, even despite this annual average being very large and only this bill only applying to Nevada's largest food scrap generators. I believe that I know that they could qualify under that, and that could potentially be a problem in some rural areas if there isn't any food relief organizations within a reasonable distance. And so that's definitely something I think would need to be addressed in any final version of this bill. I think that question would need to be answered, and maybe it isn't a problem, but I think it's definitely something that should be looked at. So moving kind of forward, excess edible food would mean any edible food that is not sold or used by a designated food scraps generator and is still safe to be consumed, but is being disposed of by the generator. But it will not include food damaged by pests, mold, bacteria, or other contamination. It would not include food subject to governmental or producer recall due to food safety. It wouldn't apply to food returned to a supplier, and it also would not apply to any food determined by the Solid Waste Management Authority to be unsafe for consumption. And I should say as well that the Solid Waste Management Authority is defined higher up in NRS Chapter 444, and it is either the local health districts for some of the larger counties, or the Nevada Department of Conservation would also apply. I, I'd also believe that the kind of the state health district and the Nevada Department of Health could serve as an advisory role when it comes to some of the food safety aspects of this, and when deciding exactly how to, I guess, creating the methodology for what food, other than the three categories listed, that they would want to determine would be unsafe for donation and consumption. So moving further on, a food relief organization would mean a religious organization or other nonprofit that provides food for free to needy individuals, including but not limited to a food pantry, a food bank, a soup kitchen, or community-based organization that provides food for free to needy individuals. And another thing that we kind of came up when we were writing this bill was whether that we should include organizations that sell food for a reduced price to people. I think for me that this would only really apply if after all traditional food relief organizations that provide food for free run out of capacity. If that happens, I don't believe that would be a problem, given kind of some of my conversations with Three Square. I believe they have an ability to take on a fairly large increase in the amount of food that is donated to them. So I don't know if including additional organizations would be necessary, but I do believe that it can be an option if when this bill is implemented, it comes to it basically comes to fruition that there's a large amount of food that ends up not being able to be donated because there isn't enough organizations ready to take it. I think implementing some form of some kind of process that would allow organizations to apply to the Solid Waste Management Authority to be considered a food relief organization could help address that problem if it arises. And then what a food rescue organization would mean is an organization that collects excess edible food from designated food scraps generators and distributes it to food relief organizations. So food rescue organizations would basically function as a middleman between food relief organizations and the entities that would be subject to the provisions of this bill. In other states that have passed food waste, other states that have passed food waste bans, a lot of these kind of middleman organizations have kind of risen up and helped facilitate this process. In Nevada, I don't believe there's any organizations that are current or that would currently be classified as food rescue organizations, but I wanted to kind of plan ahead if and when this if this bill was implemented, there very well may be a need and for food rescue organizations to help facilitate this process. And so just because there isn't really any right now doesn't mean there won't be in the future. And so I wanted to include kind of their role in this bill, their potential role in this bill as well. So those are those are the definitions that I added along with the definitions that were already in NRS Chapter 444 that would apply to this section. So moving on to the actual responsibilities and the provisions of this bill applying to the largest food scraps generators. And I just want to kind of say as a general statement as well, all of these dates that are in this bill can obviously be changed. I believe through that the dates I've put in here work well, and I've put some thought into kind of the timing on the dates, but obviously moving forward, if kind of through further research and through more information, the legislators that take up this bill or also just I don't know, any kind of concerns raised about some of the dates, they obviously can be changed. So in the current form, it would be on and after January 1st, 3 years after the effective year of this title, all designated food scraps generators shall separate at least 50% of their excess edible food for donation to food relief organizations in accordance with applicable laws, rules, and regulations related to food donation. And within this, each designated food scraps generator shall separate its excess edible food from other solid waste, ensure proper storage for excess edible food on site, which shall preclude such materials from becoming odorous or attracting vectors, such as a container that has a lid and a latch that keeps the lid closed and is resistant to tampering by rodents or other wildlife and has sufficient capacity. They would also have to collaborate with the Solid Waste Management Authority to develop the best procedures for storing, sealing, and labeling excess edible food. And I think the main point of this aspect of kind of the responsibilities would be the Solid Waste Management Authority is going to provide educational materials and work with these entities to really try and develop the best compliance plans for the entities, and make it as easy and efficient as possible to comply with the provisions of this bill. And that's really one of the main reasons that this 3-year gap is in the bill from passage to implementation. I really wanted to provide the entities that would be subject to this bill with enough time to really prepare, both from a storage capacity to a training of their employees, and also just for developing compliance plans to best comply and make it as easy as possible to comply with the provisions and the additional responsibilities they would have under this bill. And so the food scraps generators that would be subject to this bill would also have to have information available and provide training for employees concerning the proper methods to separate and store excess edible food. And they could also choose to self-haul their excess edible food to a food relief organization, or obtain a food relief organization with sufficient hauling capacities, or a third-party food rescue organization that will deliver excess edible food to a food relief organization. And all food scrap generators shall submit an annual report to the Solid Waste Management Authority on or before March 1st, 2 years after the effective year of this title, and annually thereafter in an electronic format. And this annual report must summarize the amount of food scraps generated, the amount of edible food donated, the food relief and/or rescue organizations that the designated food scraps generated collaborated with, and other information as required by the Solid Waste Management Authority. So this report would really try and provide all the needed information to the Solid Waste Management Authority when it comes to the total amount of food scraps that these entities would be generating, and also the amount of edible food that they're donating, so that the percentages can be calculated. And the reason that I made the date March 1st, 2 years before the effective date of this title, is so that before the rest of the provisions of this bill become effective, the Solid Waste Management Authority will have information from all the designated entities on the amount of food scraps they generate, and basically they can use that to then kind of help facilitate the provisions of the rest of the provisions of the bill once they become effective. And so there will be a waiver process for the for designated food scraps generators in this bill. A designated food scraps generator may petition the Solid Waste Management Authority for a temporary waiver from some or all of the requirements of this title. The petition must include evidence of undue hardship based on either the designated food scraps generator does not meet the 1 ton per week threshold despite the Solid Waste Management Authority's calculations, or the food relief organization does not have sufficient capacity to take on additional supply of excess edible food despite the Solid Waste Management Authority's calculation, or the unique circumstances of the designated food scraps generator. And if a waiver is granted, it shall be granted for no longer than 1 year in duration, and the Solid Waste Management Authority may renew such waiver at its discretion. So moving on to what the responsibilities of the Solid Waste Management Authority would be under this bill. The Solid Waste Management Authority shall publish the methodology the Solid Waste Management Authority will use to determine who is a designated food scraps generator, the waiver process, procedures to minimize odors and vectors to help entities prepare to become subject to the provisions of this bill, and also to just kind of help facilitate the process, help provide guidance for these entities. They would also have to publish a list of all designated food scraps generators, food relief organizations, and food rescue organizations. It would also publish an annual list of designated food scraps generators that were in compliance with the requirements of this title the previous year. and also an annual list of the 10 designated food scraps generators that donated the highest percentage of their excess edible food the previous year. Again, I in this version of the bill, I made the list 10. Of course, that number can be changed either to more or less. I also think a potential thing that can be done with this list is the annual, I would say that the 10 best designated food scraps generators when it comes to percentage of excess edible food the previous year could, there could be some sort of reward process involved in it. I know in other elements of NRS Chapter 444, there are some rewards that can be, that they're set aside from, that are set aside to, I guess, reward the entities that are most in compliance with this bill, and go above and beyond as well. And so also, no later than July 1st, 2 years after the effective year of this title, and annually thereafter, the Solid Waste Management Authority shall assess the capacity of each food relief organization and notify designated food scraps generators whether they are required to comply with the provisions of paragraph A of NRS 444.667, which is this paragraph up here, basically, that kind of provides the responsibilities of all the entities that are subject to this section of the bill. The date here again gives the Solid Waste Management Authority several months after they receive information from all the entities that there will be subject to this bill to kind of go through the data and compile all the necessary information to comply with these provisions. The Solid Waste Management Authority shall also develop and make it available educational materials that help designated food scraps generators, food relief organizations, and food rescue organizations comply with this title. This would include educational materials and information for entities to then use to help train some of their employees to help store food that's going to be donated in the best possible way. The Solid Waste Management Authority shall also develop educational materials on food waste minimization and encourage municipalities to disseminate those materials both on their municipal websites and in any such future mailings to their residents as they may distribute. And then finally, the Solid Waste Management Authority shall regulate food relief organizations to ensure that their activities do not impair water quality or otherwise harm human health and the environment. And along with those responsibilities of the Solid Waste Management Authority, they would also be required to, no later than January 1st, 4 years after the effective year of this title, and annually thereafter, the Solid Waste Management Authority shall submit an annual report to the governor and the legislature describing the operation of the food donation program, including the amount of edible food donated, the amount of food scraps generated, sample educational materials, and the number of waivers provided the previous year. And this report would help the legislature, the Solid Waste Management Authority, and the governor to kind of assess how this bill is working, how the food donation program is working, and make any kind of necessary adjustments or deal with any kind of unforeseen issues that arise with it. And it just allow it to really kind of assess the progress of this program and make it as efficient and as effective as possible. And eventually, in my mind, I think this would also include, if the program is working very well, if there seems to be sufficient capacity, expanding the entities that would be subject to the provisions of the bills to somewhat smaller generators of food scraps. Now, there's also a civil penalties section of the bill included in here. Now, this largely follows the civil penalties provisions higher up in the NRS Chapter 444. So some of these things can be changed. Additionally, I think there are some other potential ideas for civil penalties or some ways of structuring it that I will go over as well after reading through the section that's included in the bill at present. Except as provided in NRS 445C.010 to 445C.120, inclusive, any designated food scraps generator convicted of intentionally or recklessly violating NRS 444.667 is liable for a civil penalty upon each such conviction. And so to be subject to any civil penalties under this bill, the food scraps generator would have to intentionally or recklessly violate their responsibilities. This bill isn't looking to penalize entities for making fairly innocent mistakes when it comes to the storage of the excess edible food. Obviously, I think when it comes to the provisions on how to store the excess edible food, I think as long as those are followed with in good faith, I think the entities won't kind of run into any problems with the civil penalties. And so a court before whom a defendant is convicted of an intentional or reckless violation of the provision of NRS 444-667 shall order the defendant for a first offense to pay a civil penalty which is at least $500 but not more than $5,000. For a second offense to pay a civil penalty which is at least $1,000 but not more than $5,500. For a third offense to pay a civil penalty which is at least $1,500 but not more than $6,000. And for any subsequent offense after a third offense to pay a civil penalty which is at least $500 more than the most recent previous civil penalty that the defendant was ordered to pay pursuant to this subsection. And if so provided by the court, a penalty imposed pursuant to this section may be paid in installments. The Solid Waste Management Authority may attempt to collect all such penalties and installments which are in default in any manner provided by law for the enforcement of a judgment. And also, except as otherwise provided in this subsection, each court which receives money pursuant to the provisions of this section shall forthwith remit the money to the Division of Environmental Protection of the State Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, which shall deposit the money with the state treasurer for credit in a separate account in the state general fund. Again, a lot of this language is very similar to the civil penalties section higher up in NRS 444. And if the health authority initiated the action, or if any other person authorized to enforce NRS 444-667 initiated the action and the money collected was a violation of the NRS section, the court shall remit the money to the district health department, which shall deposit the money with the county treasurer for deposit in an account for the district health department. And money deposited pursuant to this subsection must be used only to pay for the enforcement of this title, for education regarding the proper storage of excess edible food, and for the management of solid waste. And also it can be used to pay other claims against the state or local or it can be used as other claims against the state or local governments are paid. Now, again, as I said, this is very similar to the civil penalties section higher up in NRS chapter 444, but I do think there are other potential options for civil penalties. I believe, especially when it comes to violations of the storage aspects of this bill, or storage provisions of the bill, these could just be added on as additional demerits to the overall inspection already conducted by the local health districts. It doesn't have to be an entirely separate civil penalties scheme. I think when it comes to violations of the percentage, if an entity donates less than 50% of its excess edible food, I think that can kind of follow a similar kind of structure to this. I think obviously that is a larger violation. It's to kind of the goal of the bill. I think obviously the main goal of the bill is to reach that 50% mark and to provide more food for the Nevada population that desperately needs it. And so I think when it comes to violations of that 50% mark, it can kind of be separated out from the overall inspection and have its own kind of scheme and structure of civil penalties, similar to the one that's in the bill currently. And so I'm going to stop sharing now and just kind of generally discuss potentially some of the aspects of as I mentioned, the original bill was also focused on banning food waste from landfills, and I think there's still things that can be done in the short term and in this next legislative session that can start kickstarting that process and start working towards that long-term goal of having the ability to ban most, if not all, of food waste from large food scraps generators from landfills. So let me just pull up a few things. Okay. And so when I think with the overall goal of being to reduce the amount of food waste in landfills, I also believe that the food donation aspect of this does that as well. I mean, removing 50% of excess edible food that currently is going to landfills at the moment, and removing that and diverting it to food relief organizations will have a large impact on the amount of food waste going to landfills on its own. And so that will also positive beneficial or positive environmental impacts as well. But I think when it comes to the broader goal of banning all food waste, not just excess edible food from landfills, I think what really needs to happen first is to make it more economically competitive for organics recyclers to come to Nevada and to operate in Nevada. Currently, the cost of disposing of material in general, but food waste specifically in landfills is very cheap compared to a lot of other states, and this makes it hard for organics recyclers to economically compete with landfills. If they charged what landfills were charging at the moment, they would not be able to cover the costs that it requires to run their facilities. And so I think there are a couple options when it comes to addressing this problem. Whether it be, I think the first option is, of course, making it more expensive to dispose of waste in landfills, whether that be on an increased tax of landfill usage that several other states, including Wisconsin, have implemented. There's also the alternative option of just mandating a certain percentage of food waste to be diverted to organics recyclers. And I think this is obviously going to be an easier process given the difficulty of adding or increasing taxes in Nevada. And so I think when it comes to mandates, there needs to be kind of a statewide study done on the current capacity of organics recyclers to take on additional supply of food waste. Because if, for example, if Nevada kind of just instituted let's say a 20% of food waste from the largest food scrap generators has to be diverted to organics recyclers, there's not really enough information at the moment, at least on a statewide level, to know whether organics recyclers would be able to efficiently and successfully take on that additional increase in supply. So I believe that doing a statewide study on the capacity of organics recyclers, along with things like how much, I guess, kind of it would help to pinpoint the perfect kind of percentage of food waste that should be mandated to going to organics recyclers, where it's having a large impact, but it's also possible for these organic recyclers to take on that additional supply in the current given the current kind of infrastructure in the state. And so additionally, I think the study should look into potential ways to encourage further investment and incentivize further kind of development of organics recyclers in Nevada, whether that be composting facilities or livestock farms, especially given some of the potential economic difficulties that would come with trying to build and operate a large compost facilities in some of the smaller rural areas of Nevada. It could be just through economies of scale, somewhat problematic and not as feasible as livestock farms would be in those areas. So I think it's important to focus on the many different versions of organics recyclers and how in each area of Nevada, which kind of organics recycler would be best and most efficient for that area. And so I think eventually, kind of as I work on this bill too, I would like to include kind of provisions in the bill that would help facilitate a statewide study to focus on some of these things. And I'm also definitely still planning on and kind of speaking with and meeting with members of the Nevada community that are obviously instrumental in organics recycling and have more information than I do about how a lot of this works on the ground, to just kind of further develop some of these ideas and also kind of how best to implement them. And so I also wanted to address just kind of a few general issues that that Harrison, Millie, and I kind of potentially like some of the potential issues that we kind of like realized I kind of want to discuss in this presentation. And one of them is the cutoff of 1 ton per week and the annual average of 1 ton per week good, or does it raise any potential concerns? And also, is there a way to get data on how much food waste entities are producing right now? Is this something that is collected by either the entities themselves or the local health districts, the solid waste management authorities as of now? I believe looking at other states' food waste bans and how they have been implemented, the 1 ton per week is a fairly good number. It's obviously a very large amount of food waste, and it would only apply to some of the largest food waste producers in Nevada. And so, but obviously we don't, when it comes to implementing a bill like this, we want to make sure that the number of entities that are subject to the bill is not, there aren't too many entities subject to the bill all at once. I think starting with the very largest food scraps generators is the best strategy when it comes to this, because then it'll be much easier to assess how the bill is working in its current form, and also much easier for the goals of the bill to be reached. An additional kind of issue that we came across is should we offer rewards for designated food scraps generators with the highest percentage of their excess edible food donated each year? I know I discussed this a little bit briefly when I was going through the bill, but I do think that this is potentially a way of encouraging even further donation of excess edible food than the minimum 50% amount. I mean, obviously, the goal is to increase the amount of food going to food relief organizations as much as possible. And so in any way that can encourage entities voluntarily to increase that number even higher, if possible, I believe is worthwhile. And so I think for now, I probably will just end the presentation there and just kind of see what questions people have, and that way I can kind of see what things that people kind of have concerns with or issues, and be able to focus and what areas to focus on more as this presentation continues. But thank you again.
Thank you, Alex. Do you have the ability to see who raises their hands?
I think so. Let me see. I want to say, is Wes's hand right up or up right now? Okay, perfect.
Yep,
so yes,
perfect. I'll let you call on people. Let me know if you need anything.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Wes.
So thank you. I'm with Washoe County Health District, and in reading this, it looks like we're basically double permitting all of these facilities. So you'd have a permit on a food facility through the solid waste side and a permit on the food side. A couple of comments. A lot of your proposals in this are going to be contrary to what's required in NAC 446 and our local food regulations. As far as storage and things like that, there's no definition of what's edible. Every food facility is allowed at bare minimum to keep products through 7 days. After 7 days, it's deemed trash. It's not edible per food code. You'd be looking at least, my basic estimates, I've probably got it starting around 1,500 permits that would have to be done. 3 full-time staff, we're probably looking at somewhere north of $2,000 per permit per facility based off the proposals that would be in the solid waste management requirements that you have proposed here. And that would be upfront and starting in order just to be able to implement a program of this magnitude. And I just don't see that there would be that much benefit. We already have programs locally here in town that are on a voluntary basis for most of these facilities to complete and do this. Let alone most of these facilities, if they're going to be required to have to store this product, would have to have additional storage that would have to then go through commercial plan review and the food plan review, because it's permitted as a food facility in order to even be able to store it in their site, meeting the food requirements, because the food requirements will trump any of these other requirements first. So I feel like there's a lot of overlap where there's going to be a lot of contradiction between the two sets of regulations, let alone the startup cost and just the financial hit to each of these facilities is going to be quite massive.
Great. Well, thank you for kind of bringing some of that up. So I think I'll try to address some of those concerns. So when it comes to, as you said, I was aware that when food is, they can basically entities can store food for 7 days, or then it's considered trash. But from some of my previous meetings, I was under the assumption that if that food was frozen, that clock kind of stops. So I think that would generally be the strategy and the goal that would be taken when it comes to storing some of this excess edible food. When it comes to the additional storage kind of space necessary for storing a lot of this food, I agree. I think that it definitely is going to require additional storage space. And again, that's one of the reasons I wanted to apply to only the largest food scraps generators. I think when it comes to the current number it's at of 1 ton per annual per week, again, I think if that is a number that is too large, like that is too large, and it would apply to facilities that aren't capable or don't have the storage space and aren't capable of storing their excess edible food until food relief organizations could come pick it up. I think that's something that could definitely be, that's a number that could be changed. It could be made higher, so it only applied to entities that could comply with this bill. When it comes to, sorry, I tried to write down a lot of the things you raised. When it comes to some of the double permitting things, could you explain the double permitting thing a little bit more? I'm sorry, I know that was at the beginning, so I just want to make sure I knew exactly kind of where what you were saying with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So and I'll address one of your other components is so the time stops, so to speak. So like you have 7 days, all of your food product has to be utilized in 7 days. Whole cut, any uncut veggies or whatever are allowed to obviously stay, but once they've been cut, then you have 7 days. The time does stop when it's frozen, but it doesn't get if you freeze it at 7 days, then it's done. Like it doesn't get another 7 days. You don't add time to it. So you would have no opportunity for that to be reused. And if we're having to permit the end user, then we're having to track all of that. So there would be issue. The double permitting is you've now created 2 permits on one facility through 2 separate agents, or through one agency, but 2 separate programs. You have a food permit that is going to be how they operate and in compliance with our food regulations, which are risk-based regulations. Those are through the authority comes from NRS 446. This is the Solid Waste Management Authority, which is NRS 444. That's an entirely separate group and a separate permit and separate actions and authorities that are in that. So you now have one facility with 2 separate permits, one for just their food operation, which they're going to be governed under how they operate, which this would all be inclusive as part of that. But then this is also going to have separate inspections and authorities over this with separate civil penalties that would be done. So you have 2 separate permits, 2 separate actions, 2 separate types of roles that are going to be completed. We would not have the staff nor the capabilities of combining that under one permit. It wouldn't be legal. So you have 2 permits that would have to be done. And my basic estimate just for this area and starting it, you'd be looking at, I'd probably need almost $1 million to start the program. So they'd be looking at those first 1,500 permits. They are going to be upset, and they're going to end up having multiple permitting issues because we will make them go to get building permits in order to store. So I think that there's some financial impact here to these facilities where I don't like to see things is double permitting, and that's exactly what's being proposed here.
Okay, thank you for explaining that a little bit further. So I think when it comes to what my goal was with the way I wrote this, and it very well may have to, I have not looked at NRS 446, so I'll definitely have to look through that to kind of see some of the contradictions you're talking about, or the double permitting problems. I think my goal with the way I wrote this was for it to kind of apply with like already in place kind of inspections when it comes to food donation. I know through speaking with Aaron Delgado with the Southern Nevada Health District, or sorry, Clark County Health District. I think it was Southern Nevada Health District. Sorry, that really kind of the way I was trying to craft it was I was trying to have it be included in inspections they already do, almost just apply as additional parts of that inspection, apply as a kind of additional aspects of the process that entities already go through when it comes to the way they donate food, or some of the regulations they have to comply with when it comes to it, making sure that the food they're donating is still edible and doesn't fall outside of those 7 days, or doesn't, isn't dangerous in that aspect of it. That was my intention, was to kind of include it in that process already. And so I certainly wasn't trying to create some other, I guess, wholly separate kind of process from that. And so that may be something I have to reword after I look at NRS 446 and try and make it comply with that and more consistent with that. But I don't necessarily think it would have to. I guess when it comes to the two different permits for food operation and the other permit this would create, that I guess I didn't really see it creating some other form of permit. That's obviously something I'll have to look into a little bit more and make sure that doesn't happen with the way it's written.
For the Solid Waste Management Authority to have to do the level of work that's in this regulation, there is absolutely no way that we have the capacity to do any of this. I would literally tell you no. I have no capacity to do it. I have a half a body. So I can tell you right now that in order to do any of this, there will be significant fees. It's absolutely impossible for any local jurisdiction to do this level of work.
Well, like I said, thank you again for kind of raising this concern. I think obviously that's something whether it's changing the number of entities that would be subject to the bill, or whether it's just changing some of the wording around, I think that's something, I would be very willing to kind of discuss some of this a little bit further with you. So just so I can kind of get a better understanding of how this could potentially be made easier or more cost efficient, or just apply to less entities, so it's not as much of a burden on the department and on the local kind of authorities that would have to regulate this. I think obviously some of that I'm gonna have to look a little further into before I can give solid answers or be able to make the changes necessary to address some of that.
All right, I believe David is next on your hand raised list, Alex.
Yes, sorry. Go ahead, David.
Hey, Alex and everybody, thank you for your time. So in California, which is where I'm at, I'm with Imperial Western Products. And what we have been doing is we've been doing animal feed since 1966. And then we were the first company to start doing organic recycling at, basically we call them tier 1 generators. So hotels, theme parks, grocery stores. We did that 14 years ago with the largest retailers in the world. And they are in your state, and we're currently doing it now. So obviously I'm working with Cal Recycle, right, in SB 1383, AB 1826, and AB 3041. And what they've done, along with California Department of Food and Ag and all the other entities, is they will diversify the volume of material, because you do need a capacity study, right? You need to know how much material you have and where it's at, especially with Nevada. There's different regions, but we are largely doing a lot of organic recycling in Henderson and Las Vegas, in that area. So we can definitely help you out with that. But I would say, and what I'd like to ensure, and I heard you said it multiple times, which is encouraging, that you need to remember the animal feed, they never stop. They eat 24/7, 365, right? We've been doing it. We currently are doing it. And if you don't write us into this bill, then you're not going to get the data for the diversion. So that's one. Two, I would encourage you guys looking at the EPA food recovery hierarchy, where you're talking about source reduction, right? Source reduction is a fantastic tool. When we first started out recycling with the largest retailers in the world, they started at 16 tons per week, right? Now they're at 6. That's a 10-ton reduction for all these stores, which is thousands. And that's a massive source reduction. GHG creating all that extra food waste, and we're teaching them how to reduce it. So then you want to go into next is human consumption, which is what you're at, right? That 50% mark. But what I would say is California has a 20% mark, right? And I would encourage you guys to look at what Cal Recycle is doing, where they tier it up, and I'm sure you're already doing that. But it's a progressive movement, but they're only going to get 20. And talking to food banks in California, they already have a lot of material. And I can't remember the other gentleman's name, Wesley, the capacity of refrigeration is going to be very difficult. So that's why you do want to include, obviously, a higher the best use, human consumption, source reduction, human consumption, animal feed, industrial uses. I'm one of the largest biodiesel manufacturers in the West Coast. So we take all the used cooking oil from Nevada, most of it technically, and we take it to our plant in Coachella and make biodiesel out of that. So I work for a very green company, but I want to make sure that we are part of the solution and not the problem. Because if you don't write us in, I'm not going anywhere. Neither is my industry, right? And then we're going to have issues with waste haulers and all that versus animal feed in California is exempted from franchise waste agreements. We're just part of the solution. We ourselves did 700,000 tons of food waste last year, which it's not food waste because you can't feed waste to an animal, but it's inedible food material. So if it couldn't be donated or if it's off spec, whatever the case may be, we handle it. We pick it up at the grocery store. We pick it up at the hotels, which we're already doing, and then we turn it into animal feed.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, David. That was a lot of additional information too that I didn't know. And I agree. I think it's important to include every kind of aspect and every entity that's obviously part of the solution in this. And I definitely have kind of been thinking and really trying to make sure that I don't leave anyone that's very essential to this or could be part of the solution out of this. So I think that's definitely one of my focuses. And I think a lot, as I said, the information you provided will help with that and things I can look further into.
Yeah, and I have no problem working with you and your team, helping, if you want some language. Obviously, we have different code sections, but Title 14 CCR Section 17402 in California talks about rendering activities, and it talks about rescue salvage opportunities. It talks about human consumption. It talks about all those, and it lines out what is tasked towards the diversion of it. So whatever counts towards the landfill diversion. And if we get offline, I can give you my email. I can send PSN my contact information. Make sure that we get let's get it right the first time, and I'll help you out.
I would absolutely definitely love to meet with you further. And I think when it comes to writing this bill and making sure everything that is necessary is included, that's definitely what I want, and that's why I want to keep kind of fixing some of the problems that are in this, and why I'm very happy to kind of hear about some of the issues now rather than having to deal with them during potential legislative session or having issues come up that weren't considered before. I definitely want to try and address as many of those potential concerns as possible. So I would love to meet with you further. Thank you.
Okay, let's do it. Yeah, I will. I'll send you my email, and then whoever I need to get going, and we'll do a meeting in the next week or two.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alex, I went ahead and put your email in the chat for people as well.
Thank you. Okay, and I see there's a bunch of kind of comments in that chat too. So let me scroll up and I'll try to, I don't think there's any other, or there's one. Oh, just David has his hand raised. Okay, so yeah, so I'll start going through some of the chat questions. Let me just scroll to the top. Okay, so when it comes to the definition of excess edible food, this is something that I included in the bill a little bit. I realize is very general in the definition and the bill form. This is something that I was under the assumption that the kind of the current structure of how regulation of food donation does define excess or define edible food that's safe for consumption and donation. And so I think it would operate under that same definition, and also would be in the control of the departments and regulators that already kind of that already regulate that definition and decide what the definition is. I basically any kind of I don't want to create any kind of inconsistency with the already in place definition. So I believe that the definition that's already in place would function in the same way if this bill was added. So let's see. Okay, perfect. And then we just talked about some of the animal feed aspects of that. Okay, let's see. Okay, you don't want to donate prison food to anyone. What we serve our prisoners in Nevada is extremely unhealthy: crap, white bread, processing lunch meat, cereal, fresh fruits, and veggies. That's definitely great information. I think that's something I probably knew, but I kind of just, flew my mind, but I agree. I think that because that's the case, correctional facilities can probably be exempt. I kind of had some concerns about correctional facilities anyway. So I think exempting them from the bill it wouldn't be a problem when it comes to that. Okay. And then from Tara, UNLV's food contractor is Aramark. At other universities, Aramark has a food recovery program and operates the program effectively and efficiently. The Food Recovery Network operates at many universities, 200 plus. UNR also has a chapter according to the website. Well, perfect. Thank you for providing that link. I'll definitely kind of look into that. That sounds like a really good program. Perfect. Okay. And then a little further. Sorry, I don't know why my computer is being weird. There we go. Okay. And then I have done waste audits at elementary schools, and they have a large amount of donatable food, including fruit, packaged foods, and unopened milks. So I actually originally, kind of my first job out of college was working at elementary school. And I, in my experience, and somewhat limited, obviously, I've kind of ran across that as well, is that there was a lot of food that was, while schools obviously provide a lot of food to kids that really need it, I think there is a lot that could be donated and ends up going to waste. So I agree. I think when it comes to lower educational facilities, I think that it would be good to include them, given some of the I guess given the amount of food that kind of goes to waste in lower educational facilities. It's not just higher educational facilities. And then, okay, perfect. And then from Cassie, I think there might need to be some additional definition and implementation plan for unprepared versus prepared and perishable versus non-perishable foods, since there's a very different process for ensuring safety of food recovery for those different categories. I would say the same for retail/grocery versus restaurant/casino, as the makeup of the type of foods from each would differ significantly, and in turn have different implementation timelines based on resource/infrastructure needs. I definitely agree. Thank you for bringing that issue up. And I think that's something that can kind of be further fine-tuned, and additional information can be added to that bill section. When it comes to how best to store food and how best to kind of categorize food into different categories that would make it kind of easier to, I guess easier, and also just better for determining when certain types of food should be donated, how it should be stored. I think obviously a lot of that stuff needs to be laid out and needs to be figured out. Again, the kind of food safety regulators in place already obviously know much more about this than I do. And so I didn't want to, in this version of the bill, at least kind of try and go into too much detail when I didn't have all the probably necessary information. But I definitely think in any final version of this bill, or moving forward, that those kind of differentiations and categories can be made, and to kind of further improve the program and how to store the excess edible food. Okay. And then from Jessica, how will the inspection/enforcement actions be funded? So through some of the civil penalties, basically any kind of civil penalties incurred from this would go towards helping provide funds for inspections and enforcement of this bill. I do think that there probably would be further need for additional funding beyond that. I know obviously a lot of the Nevada's allocation from the American Rescue Plan, the discretionary funds, has still been unallocated, and looking at Governor Sisolak's kind of general framework on some of the things he wanted to spend the money on. I believe that something like this would kind of qualify under those general goals of what he wants to allocate that money to. Obviously, that would only be a temporary that would be a temporary kind of influx of money. I think when it comes to a more consistent influx of money, there may have to be some kind of additional fee or tax, whether it be on landfill usage, to help is a potential example of a tax that could help fund further enforcement of this. From West, have you evaluated the financial impact of this proposal? I have evaluated it to some extent, and as I kind of just previously mentioned, I do think that beyond the civil penalties, there will be need for additional funding, and so I think moving forward, I think maybe laying out maybe some of the potential ways to fund the enforcement of this is obviously going to be important. And then from Des, how did the 50% figure get determined? Is the plan to start there and increase the percentage over time based on how the programs work, logistical items work, etc.? So the 50% again kind of does serve as, I mean, I think 50% has some reasons behind it, but it did mostly serve as a placeholder. Kind of like the dates, a lot of the percentages can be changed and adjusted as necessary. And as David brought up, California has 20%, and so that I think the 50% figure may be a little too ambitious. I think I wanted to start with a fairly ambitious number and maybe adjust it accordingly if needed. And so I think that's potentially something that may need to be done to make it more feasible and to make it basically possible for entities to comply with this, and also for regulators to be able to enforce it. And then Wes talks about the ability to store excess edible food, which we talked about previously, and I definitely think is an issue that needs to be addressed. Again, whether it's increasing the 1 ton per week number to a higher number, to where it only applies to facilities that would have the ability to have the additional space to store some of that excess edible food. I do think also that the waiver process could help with potential issues. I think if an entity can show that they just don't have any possible ability to store excess edible food in the necessary quantities, then they can apply for a waiver and be granted one by the Solid Waste Management Authority. Okay, and then Deb also said that is not unlike what manufacturing facilities have to do, though we have multiple permits with multiple entities for overlapping equipment, process, etc. Yeah, so I think I will be completely honest, I definitely need to do more research when it comes to some of the potential contradictions and problems with permitting. And as I said, it wasn't really my intention to create any contradictions or overlapping permits that don't, well, not necessarily overlapping permits, but permits that basically aren't able to work in tandem. So I think looking further into that, I definitely want to kind of address that potential concern and get more research before I can give the definitive answer, I guess, to that. And then Wes said you will also have to specifically look at Washoe County food regulations, so the Nevada Health District food regulations, and the Carson City Douglas County food regulations. We all have specific food facility regulations that supersede the state regulations. Yes, and that's definitely why I kind of want to give most of the authority on when it comes to food safety, when it comes to regulating the food that we donate, to the local health districts, to the regulators that are already regulating food donation. Again, I was under the assumption that by doing that, it would help ease kind of the burden on the health districts, and it would kind of make it more seamless, almost in their ability just to kind of continue doing what they're doing, just on a broader scale. And as I said, I definitely realize that will require additional funds and perhaps additional workforce to help regulate that. But I do think that ideally that the kind of how food waste bans have and bills similar to this have worked in other states is it's definitely, the goal is to have voluntary compliance be as high as possible. I think any kind of bill like this is going to be fairly difficult to have incredibly strict enforcement of. So I think really the a carrot instead of a stick approach is really the goal. And I think given the nature of this problem, and I think the ability of everyone to realize that food insecurity in Nevada and the environmental impacts of food waste are a problem that needs to be addressed. I think a lot of entities, especially when a lot of the casinos are doing stuff similar to this already, and I think a lot of entities would be would be interested in doing something like this. So as long as it was made easy and the state worked with them to help develop compliance plans to make it as cost efficient and effective as possible, I think that voluntary compliance for something like this can be fairly high without having to have incredibly strict enforcement of it. And then if there's going to be any form of reporting or requirements, there will be staffing needed and permitting fees for those facilities to be regulated. Yes, again, I think when it comes to additional fees and the additional funds needed to operate some of the provisions of this bill, I think that needs to kind of be laid out in more detail on how that funding will be acquired. And so I see your hands up, Wes. So I think I'll just call on you two before I get too much further down. Oh, I think you're still muted. I don't know if you're.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you. I hit it. It just didn't like the way I hit it. So you make a really good point. And I think that if you're going, I'm not saying that this is a bad idea. I just don't like the level of permitting and requirements that are tied to it. And that's just my honest opinion. It's going to create, it's nice to create positions, and I don't mind creating positions, but it's going to be very expensive and costly positions in order to make this lift. This is a very, very heavy lift. But if the intent is to be something that's voluntary and gaining compliance, then take it out of the regulation. We can put it into the sustainable solid waste management plan that we're working on as a program that becomes voluntary and that we can do something different with. If it is in regulation the way it is, then our hands get forced and we are going to either have to attempt to do it or literally blow it off. And then at some point, one of us is getting in trouble for doing one of those. So maybe a better step forward would be to take a look at it and instead of doing a BDR in this method, go forward with more of a voluntary type of a program, which we already have up here. We already have these things. No, they're not being tracked. We could figure out a mechanism that we could do something slightly different, that we might be able to utilize some of our existed restricted funding that I know Darren and I and Kayla have talked about, that might create a mechanism where we would be able to track it that already has an existing funding mechanism, so you're not putting double permitting. That would be my 2 cents, because the other thing is you'll never get this in 446 for food because it is designed as risk-based, and this is not risk-based. Our food inspections are risk-based food inspection based off the fact that I assume that you go into a food facility and try not to buy something that's going to kill you. And that's the basis of how we do those inspections. So this would not fall into that. So we couldn't do it because if we did that, then we lose our standardizing practices with FDA. So it can't be combined with a food side. So it ends up getting separated, but we could tackle this in a different way without going down the path of permitting, if it's voluntary.
No, and I definitely appreciate you being honest. The reason I'm doing is going into this, when I started this project, I certainly was not a food waste expert, and I fully realized that. I just, I saw a problem that I felt like could be addressed, and especially when it comes to some of the really negative aspects of it, when it comes to food insecurity, when it comes to environmental kind of problems that are caused by the amount of food waste going into landfills. And so I certainly want all the feedback I can get and try to address some of the issues. And when it comes to making something like this more voluntary, kind of implementing it, or I guess almost just adjusting the programs or systems already in place, it's certainly something that I'm willing to look into and further discuss with you too. I know, obviously you have a lot of kind of relevant information that I didn't have before, and that even though I've obviously learned a lot about this process, and I do feel like I have a large amount of information on how this kind of plays out on the ground, and some of the more intricate parts of how this works in general. I certainly would love to kind of further discuss some of this, and how maybe turning it into an aspect of the already in place voluntary programs would work, and some of the ways that it could be written to do so. And so, yeah, I mean, I definitely would love to kind of further discuss that with you. Okay, so I don't think there's any other hands, right? Okay, so I will keep going through with some of the questions in the chat. If I can pull it up, there we go. Okay, and then Jessica said, some of the funding concerns. How does this program get funded, and what are those costs? Again, yeah, I think as I said, that this is definitely something that needs to be laid out in more detail. Providing some of the possibilities, again, whether it be increased tax on landfill usage, whether it be through civil penalties, whether it be kind of a one-time, a starting kind of, I guess, like a base to start this program through some of the discretionary funds from the American Rescue Program. Those are some of the things I have kind of thought out, but I definitely think that there's other options, and I think that some of that obviously has to be laid out in more detail before this can be implemented. Okay, and then Wes said, we already have programs locally that support animal feed and food donations. Unfortunately, in Northern Nevada, we do not have the large animal feed organizations that would be able to support the necessary recycled food. It is an issue we have been talking about for a long time, trying to figure out a way to get more infrastructure here. Yes, especially with talking with a bunch of people, and in my opinion as well, the infrastructure is definitely, when it comes to kind of reducing food waste in landfills in general, is the biggest area of concern that needs to be addressed, and also probably the first issue that needs to be tackled, but just increasing the alternatives to landfills to make it easier, and make it easier for people to kind of divert from landfills, and also to give the ability of organics recyclers to take on additional supply. And then Kayla, thank you for putting my email in there. And then further funding mess, right? Don't see it be fully funding through civil penalties. I agree for sure. Same thing about civil penalties. Let's see this time. Do you have any current accepted methodologies that establish the mechanism to determine the amount of food scraps? So are you asking, is there already an accepted methodology on how to determine like the total amount of food scraps that entities are producing?
Yeah, like, is there an accepted, I don't know, whatever math equation or something that's already being utilized? Or like, if we went forward with this, would we be creating something from scratch and basically making it up?
Yes. So I think from what I've seen from other states that have implemented this, they basically, the process that is kind of used to determine this methodology is that the entities that would be subject to this bill would separate their food waste out from other waste that they have. I think that's definitely a question I kind of want to discuss in here. This too is how, as I said, it is operating other states in that way. Entities are basically separating the food waste from other waste and then weighing it themselves. Or I think also, additionally, when it comes to some of the food that's donated, some of the food relief organizations can weigh or kind of, I guess, collect data on how much food is being donated from certain entities. So that can help kind of with the burden on the entities themselves. They don't have to do the whole process on their own. But I do think, just kind of when I saw that, one of the things that I wanted to know was how much of an additional burden is that on the entities that would be subject to the bill. Is that something that they have found to be fairly possible, especially if they're kind of work with the state to develop the best procedures on how to do that? Or has that been a large burden to entities that are subject to the bill in states such as Massachusetts or New York. California just recently passed their food waste bill, so I don't know. I don't know if there's too much on the ground experience of how it works there, but Vermont as well. So I think that's something that I kind of thought of it originally. In the things I've researched and the things I've seen, there hasn't been any at least major complaints from entities on that. So I think again, at least in the things that I've read and kind of looked through, that hasn't been raised as some like really massive problem with implementation of a food waste bill. And okay, but the waiver is only for 1 year, which will also cost additional funds per time it is utilized. When it comes, I'm assuming you're talking about additional funds for like the state to like renew the waiver, or to kind of like assess whether that an entity would still be qualify for a waiver. I'm assuming that's kind of what you're talking about with that.
Yeah, I mean, since it's a year waiver, you'd have to fill out the paperwork, apply. You'd have to come before my board. I'm going to charge you about $5,000 every time you want to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think that's something that either if that's kind of turns out to be unworkable, I think that's something where the time the waiver is good for can be increased, or if someone was already previously granted a waiver, maybe the process for applying to renew the waiver is not as extensive as the process for applying original waiver, making it a little easier just to renew it if much of the conditions that the original waiver was granted for are still in place and are still true. So I think there's a couple different ways to kind of adjust that. But that's definitely a good point to bring up. I definitely hadn't thought of that. So thank you. And then from Cassie, I think the tracking and reporting would be a lift for this, although not impossible, but specifically tracking what's not making it into the donations that was still edible, as in if the edible food is not diverted to feed people, it winds up organics or landfill, but it is currently not a standard practice to then track what percentage of what ends up in organics or organic recyclers or landfills would have been edible. And that's something that, again, kind of just like on its face, when I thought it was like, okay, this may be a little bit harder to determine percentage wise what food is still edible if it's I guess chosen not to be donated. I can see how that can be a little bit heavier of a lift and make it a little bit more challenging. And so again, I think maybe instead of taking a percentage of excess edible food, it could be just a percentage of food waste in general. The only problem I thought might occur with that is that also might be kind of, I don't know. I guess that would be a little bit easier, because then you wouldn't have to separate food waste into two different categories. You would just have to donate a certain percentage of food waste that obviously is still edible. I think the percentage then would certainly have to be lowered, because obviously a large amount of food waste isn't still edible. So if entities would have to donate 50% of their food waste, that very well may be 90% of excess, or they'd have to donate basically 90% of their excess edible food kind of under that percentage. But I'd have to kind of look into the numbers a little bit more on that. But I think that's definitely something to think about and maybe adjust. And then I saw, David, that your hand was up too, so you can go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. So just to echo what everybody's saying, and I'm in the middle of obviously California and dealing with it on all the agencies, telling somebody that they have to do whatever. So the restaurant, the grocery store, the theme park, the hotel will figure out what they can donate, and they're already doing that, FYI. So we work with the largest retailers. The stuff that's completely edible, they will put it in a certain bin. It'll become edible, and St. Mary's or whomever comes and picks it up. However, the stuff that really got squished, nobody's gonna, and I'm telling this right now, nobody's gonna eat a cake that all the frosting got squished on top. Then that goes in my bin, right? But they're doing it at that level. They've already been doing it for the last decade plus. So you can't really micromanage these people, because A, they're a business, they know how to run it, right? Let them do it. Two, we're already there, so they already know how to upcycle this material, meaning they're not wanting to downcycle it, they're going to want to upcycle it. So one, human consumption, two, animal feed, and so on and so forth. they will let them do that. The regulation's already written in California. You can, you know, look at that a little closely. And the 20% mark, even in California, is going to be really, really difficult because they're already getting a lot of material. So I know there's food insecurity for sure. However, 50%, I'm just worried that that's a very large number. And unless you do a capacity study, that's going to be hard to even, you're going to have to get the pulse on every food bank in Nevada and then go walk it and say, can you handle 18 tons per day more? And where are you going to put it? Right. So that's what I'm saying is, I would consider any and all options, source reduction, animal feed, all that kind of stuff. And then the 50% is going to be hard. Maybe you tier it up, you know, but you know, it's up to you.
Yes, no, I think especially kind of looking at California's number of 20%, I think the 50% was somewhat arbitrary when I wrote this and definitely subject to change. I think I kind of wanted to make it ambitious so that if necessary, it could be brought down. And I think just kind of from hearing what you're saying and some of the other concerns that probably is something that would have to happen. And you raise a good point as well. I think possibly one of the ways to kind of address what the original bill was trying to do as well is just diverting from landfills, instead of maybe separating the two, including it as kind of, as you said, let's say 20% of food waste from these from the entities that would be subject to the bill would have to be diverted to either organics recyclers or food relief organizations. It can kind of almost be combined and then also make it easier on the entities. They don't have to kind of have these different categories. It just has to basically, I guess, with the main goal being it's diverted from landfills. Obviously, I think the reason I wanted to separate in the beginning was I wanted to prioritize edible food still going to food relief organizations, given the food insecurity problems in Nevada, and
Right.
just kind of personally me seeing that as the most, I guess, urgent problem to address. But I do think that's something that entities probably voluntarily want to do anyway. I mean, it's certainly not something I'm the only person that knows that. I think entities know that as well. So I think that's
right. What they have is called an ESG program, right? So they're all trying to lower. They're trying to do electrification and trying to run on biodiesel. They're trying to donate, and they get a write-off, right? So it's cheaper for them to donate it and write it off versus picking it up with, you know, us. I do pay for the material depending on how clean it is. Also, that's another added benefit with something like my company is, if it's really, really clean, I'll actually buy it off you. You know what I mean? So they're actually making money on the back end. So there's a lot of different opportunities, and that's why you broaden it and diversify the recycling. You'll get there, and you'll get there fast, right? So, and technically, you could already use our numbers now. So I think you guys even have the Department of Nevada Agriculture. So if you work with their team and not just the waste, but you encompass everybody, like we do with California Department of Food and Ag, it's called a tonnage tax. So it's also the Nevada Department of Food and Ag, or Food Agriculture. I just looked right now on their online. You have to pay a tonnage tax for every ton, right? It's 15 cents. Well, right there, you'll know that every ton that you divert, then you can just use that towards your numbers. But you can use the NDA, Nevada Department of Agriculture. You do waste management, put them all together, and you'll get your results quickly.
Perfect. Yeah, no, that sounds, that's just kind of goes towards the general goal of this, is I think finding the way to best make it run as efficiently and as possible with all the different kind of departments and state departments and entities kind of working in tandem. And as you mentioned, I know a lot of the entities already have a lot of the knowledge and kind of systems in place to make this run effectively. And that's something that I definitely want with this as well. Like during the 3-year gap, I think the state working with entities that already are doing things like that, especially given that kind of the unique aspect of Nevada having casinos that are very kind of focused on this and do a lot of this already, and having a lot of some of the best knowledge in the world around this, I think can be very helpful to entities that aren't doing this, but would maybe want to do it if it could be made cost efficient. And so I think, just kind of working in tandem with all that already knowledge that's in state is definitely one of my hopes with this as well. Okay, so then I'll just continue. There's a few more in the chat. Let me see, where was I? Okay, perfect. So Wes talked about making a voluntary program and do not put it into any regulations. If this is put into a regulation, then it must be enforced. And we obviously talked about that a little bit when you bring that up. And I think that's definitely something I would love to talk with you further and look into and see how that could possibly be done. Rebecca said that sounds like more study needs to be done. Is it possible to write this as creating study that includes community-based organizations and agencies that conclude with a report to the legislature? So maybe a concurrent resolution. Yeah, I do think that was kind of one of the things I wanted to do, especially given some of the infrastructure problems and just some of the complexities when it comes to diverting from landfills. I think a study was necessary on that. And kind of as David just said, maybe this is something that doesn't need to be separated. Maybe this is something that can just be a percentage of food waste that has to be diverted to one of either A, organics recyclers, or B, food relief organizations. So maybe a broader study just on the entire thing is something that is kind of the starting point for this and will provide a lot of the, I guess, more specific data and needed information to implement this in the best way. I definitely think that's a possibility. And then Cassie said on Wes's comment on the methodology, are the other states that are doing this type of edible food diversion requirement, do they have municipal composting? I think, so I just want to make sure, when you say municipal composting, are you saying, is it either that municipals are buying end product composting or that the municipalities themselves actually own the composting facilities?
Just that there's composting available to all sizes of businesses and yeah, that it's throughout the community.
Mm-hmm. So I think I know in California, from what I've looked into, I know a lot of they do have quite a bit more composting facility kind of in, because composting facilities already in place and their infrastructure in the industry is a lot. There's a lot more infrastructure in place than there is in Nevada. And I also know that municipalities in California are kind of consistent buyers of end waste compost for use when they're laying parks or when they're laying roads. And so I think that further increase or kind of incentivizes people to get into the composting industry or kind of, I guess, incentivizes the growth of the composting industry because they kind of have a consistent end buyer, which makes it more economically feasible. When it comes to whether they're providing it for all businesses, I am not exactly sure. That's something I would have to look further into. Because I just don't want to. I feel like I could give an educated guess based on what I've read, but I don't want to give any answer that I don't know for sure on that. So
mentioned a methodology for like the mechanisms to determine the amount of food scraps, and I would imagine that it would be extra difficult for any municipality, like counties or cities that don't have composting, because at that point all organics and like are being mixed in with landfill, and so it would be, even like you said, it would really be on the individuals, companies, et cetera, to be weighing that, which obviously a lot of extra large companies do, but there's still some that might fit into that category that wouldn't have the infrastructure to do that. But if there was composting offered at, like, for example, in San Francisco, curbside composting, I'm pretty sure that's offered as well for businesses, they would be able to track, at least from there, for that to like tie into what Wes's question was regarding the methodologies for determining how much food scraps an establishment has to begin with.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, that's something I did not know previously, but I think that could definitely be something that could help with one of the concerns that I saw just kind of facially looking at it is this going to be a huge burden on the entities to determine on their own? And so I think that is definitely a potential way to make it easier on entities. They won't have to kind of calculate all their percentages and the total amount of food waste they have on their own. I think I will definitely, here, I'm going to write that down too. I'm going to look into that and how some of the other places that have food waste bans do that, and whether some of those things are offered in Nevada right now. Let me see. Okay, and then Wes said, Cassie, that's a great point. The location, the ability to do composting is one of the issues that makes or breaks the ability to make this successful. So yes, that's definitely, I agree. I think that, thank you again for bringing that up. I want to look further into that. I think that could help kind of address a couple of the concerns that I saw and that other people saw as well. And then Tara said, maybe increase the 1 ton per week figure to try it out. UNLV generates 9 to 12 tons of food waste per month, depending on class schedule. We divert hours to livestock. We have been diverting food waste since 2009. If you have any questions, we do not have a donation program though. All our discarded food goes to livestock feed. We have a food pantry and we collect food waste for livestock feed from them. They cannot use everything they get and they are given expired packaged food by grocery stores and Target. Yes, and I think that kind of raises one of the issues why, or one of the things that made me want to kind of, I guess, add to the already in place programs surrounding food waste and food donation specifically. What I've kind of found, and it's not only in Nevada, it's also in many other states, is that when it comes to food waste diversion programs, food donation is not always I guess given first priority, and a lot of that is because it's a lot of when it comes to giving discarded food to livestock feed, obviously livestock farms or organic recyclers in general can take on more food waste, and obviously there's a lot of food waste that isn't edible food, and so it's just easier to give it to livestock farms than rather having to determine what food is still edible and still safe to donate. And so I do think that's probably a big reason for that. But I think that's also one of the reasons I wanted to do this was to try and further incentivize food donation as one of the first options if possible. But I definitely agree. I think it's that the 1 ton per week figure can be changed if necessary. Again, that was mostly based on looking at other states' laws and seeing some of the figures that they used. But I think to start, I know Vermont, for example, they kind of have had a tiered approach where they started with 2 tons per week, they went to 1, and then a half ton per week, a third ton per week, and now it actually applies to all applies to all food waste in landfills. Obviously, Vermont's a lot smaller, and it's a very different dynamic than Nevada, and so I think there's differences that need to kind of be applied in any bill or program in Nevada than in Vermont, but I think that 1 ton number is definitely able to be changed if necessary. And then Tara, I
think that one of the things is that donating food to humans is a lot harder because there's a lot more rules. The temperature it's kept at, the temperature it's stored at, how long was it sitting out, for the prepared food, because obviously our dining commons is very much a buffet style food place, but there is stuff in there that they could donate to humans. Our Subway sandwich, the 2 shops on campus, I can't even tell you how much bread we get from them. It's perfectly fine. They just made it that day and they just throw it away. But it's hard for them to do that. It's easier for them to throw it in our food collection bins, and then we weigh it, and then we put it in something else for the livestock farm to come. And a bill like this would actually make them have to look at it. Donation to humans. I call it donation to humans. I don't think even calling it food waste is a good idea, because it's not waste, and everybody's using that word. And can you imagine being one of those humans that gets it and everyone's calling it food waste? It's food donation to humans. And there's a difference between what is and isn't donatable. Food waste covers everything, for sure, but I think differentiating is important, and the words we use are important. Even in the bill, food scraps, if the bill is just talking about food to human donation, it shouldn't use the word scraps. So I think that's important to look at, like the way the words are being used in it. If it does make it, out of committee and anywhere is what words should be being used and how and defining them. Because I personally have a hard time with people saying organic waste and then people get confused. Do you mean pesticide free waste? And I'm like, no, carbon based waste. Words matter.
Absolutely. I completely agree, especially when it comes to talking about food waste or talking about still edible food as food waste. And that's why I definitely wanted to differentiate it in the bill and call food that was still safe for donation as excess edible food, because I agree. I think it's important just for kind of general reasons of yes, this isn't waste. It's still very valuable food for many people who desperately need it. And also too, I think it's important to realize that this food still, from even a legal perspective, this food still has a lot of value. It's certainly not garbage or waste. And kind of to the general point about it makes it a little bit harder it's harder for entities to donate to food relief organizations rather than just diverting it to organic recyclers in general. I think that's one of the main reasons why I wanted to kind of add on to some of the voluntary programs that are already in place. And in my opinion, by kind of the best way to do that was to make it at some level, to make it mandatory to kind of focus on donating food to humans. As you said, I think I think it's not necessarily much harder, but it's certainly it's more steps, and as you said, there's more regulations surrounding it. And so I think if it's not mandated in some form or not encouraged in some form, it won't be prioritized. And while I think all the other types of organic recycler or kind of diversion from landfills are very important and should be included in this process as well, and certainly shouldn't have their place in this as well. I think the main goal is to try and divert, especially the food that's still edible, to food relief organizations and to the population of Nevada that really needs it. I think, as I said, the other organics recyclers, diverting food to them or diverting food waste to them as well is very important. But I do think that the most urgent kind of concern with this is getting food to people who need it, especially given Nevada's kind of unfortunately high levels of food insecurity. But thank you for that, Tara. I appreciate it. And then I think all the rest of the comments are mostly just saying people have to hop off. But thank you again to all those people that were there and provided all the comments and just listened in general. I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of present in front of all of you, and I will take all the information and questions that were provided to me as well to really try and fix some of those concerns. Obviously, I know this is ambitious, and I know it's something that has complexities, and it's not simple to kind of formulate into perfect statutory language. So all the additional information I can get and all the potential concerns that I didn't previously think of or information I didn't previously know will be really helpful in that process of making sure that whatever form this bill is or whatever form this initiative is in, it's the best possible form and has the best chance of being as effective and beneficial as possible. But I don't know if anyone else has any additional questions or comments. The Food Recovery Network really does have all this figured out. I've looked into some of the Food Recovery Network stuff, and I agree they do amazing work. And it's something that I think I can take a lot of inspiration from, and also just I guess kind of use a lot of their systems and strategies as well as moving forward with this. But I don't think I see any additional hands. So thank you again. I appreciate the ability to kind of present with everyone and with everyone that made comments and that would like to further kind of individually talk about. I'm happy to meet as many times as possible to try and make this as to get as much information on this as possible and to make this bill as good as possible. So I think as Kayla put my email in the chat earlier, but I'll just put it down here so that it's more, it's closer to the bottom. But thank you everyone again. And anyone that would like to further talk about this or has further information, I would love to kind of correspond with you through email and meet with you if possible too.